What if I told you that one of history's most infamous mutinies ended in an isolated paradise, turned into a nightmare of power struggles, forbidden passions, and deadly secrets? Pitcairn Island, a remote dot in the middle of the Pacific, became home to a handful of shipwrecked souls, people whose lives became intertwined in a battle for survival, love, and control. But who were these castaways, and what dark truths did they uncover as they navigated their deepest desires in a place where society's rules no longer applied? Join us as we uncover the shocking, untold story of Pitcairn Island, where paradise quickly turned into purgatory. In 1789, the British ship HMS Bounty was sent on a mission to gather breadfruit plants from the island of Tahiti and take them to the Caribbean. The idea was simple. Britain wanted to use the plants to feed slaves in its colonies, but the mission was far from smooth. The ship was led by Captain William Bligh, a strict and harsh leader who demanded discipline from his crew. After spending months in Tahiti, a tropical paradise with a relaxed way of life, the crew found it hard to return to the rigid rules of naval life. Tahiti's laid-back culture and the freedom the sailors experienced there made them frustrated with their tough, disciplined lives on the ship. Tensions quickly rose, and soon a mutiny was on the horizon. Led by Fletcher Christian, Bligh's second-in-command, a group of 18 men overthrew the captain and seized control of the ship. But once the rebellion had begun, there was no turning back. Fletcher Christian and his fellow mutineers, knowing they'd be hunted by the British Navy, sought refuge in the most secluded place they could find: Pitcairn Island, an uninhabited and obscure patch of land in the middle of nowhere. Christian, along with 8 of the mutineers, 6 Tahitian men and 12 Tahitian women, set sail in search of their safe haven. Originally, there had been 18 mutineers who overthrew Captain Bligh, but not all of them remained on the ship. Some chose to stay behind in Tahiti. Fearing capture, Christian led the smaller group away, eventually stumbling upon Pitcairn Island, whose position had been misrecorded on maps, making it the perfect hideout. The island was paradise on the surface, lush, green, fertile, and surrounded by the endless blue expanse of the Pacific. But as the group would soon discover, paradise can quickly become a prison. Upon landing, the mutineers wasted no time in scuttling the HMS Bounty, sinking the ship to ensure they wouldn't be found. For a time, they lived in relative peace, establishing a community and dividing the land amongst themselves. But as the days turned into months and the months into years, tensions began to simmer beneath the surface. The island's population consisted of 15 men and 12 women. You can imagine the complicated dynamics that would emerge in such a confined and isolated space. These weren't strangers. They had shared the intense experience of mutiny and were now faced with the realities of survival. Relationships, both emotional and physical, became entangled. The Tahitian men quickly realized they were at a disadvantage as the mutineers began claiming the Tahitian women as their own. This imbalance of power led to festering resentment, and it wasn't long before violence erupted. One of the first signs of trouble came with the division of the women. Some of the mutineers took multiple wives, while others were left with none. Fletcher Christian, the leader of the group, found himself particularly drawn to a Tahitian woman named Maimiti, with whom he fathered several children. The other men, both the mutineers and the Tahitians, watched with envy as Christian seemed to have the lion's share of both power and affection. The Tahitian men, furious at being treated as second-class citizens, decided they had had enough. They conspired to overthrow the mutineers, leading to a bloody conflict that claimed lives on both sides. By the time the dust settled, all but one of the Tahitian men had been killed, as well as 5 of the mutineers. The once idyllic island had descended into a cycle of betrayal, bloodshed, and despair. With so many of the men dead, the community's population became even more imbalanced. The remaining men, Christian, Edward Young, John Adams, and a few others, now held absolute power over the surviving women. But this power was fragile. The women, too, were growing restless, chafing under the control of the mutineers and the harsh conditions of island life. Some of them had been forced into relationships, while others had lost their loved ones in the violence. Their resentment simmered quietly, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The intimate relationships on Pitcairn were as tangled as the island's dense vegetation. Love, lust, jealousy, and desperation became inescapable. Christian's relationship with Maimati, though seemingly strong, was built on the shaky foundations of a community in chaos. The other men, particularly Edward Young, began taking more and more liberties with the remaining women, and the women in turn sought ways to regain some semblance of control over their own lives. As time went on, Fletcher Christian, the once charismatic leader of the mutineers, became increasingly paranoid. He feared that the island's inhabitants, both the women and the remaining men, would eventually turn on him, just as they had turned on each other. His paranoia grew to the point where he secluded himself from the rest of the group, retreating into isolation. Eventually, his worst fears came true. One fateful night, Christian was ambushed and murdered by one of the remaining mutineers, marking the end of his reign on Pitcairn Island. But Christian's death didn't bring peace to the island. If anything, it only intensified the conflict. The remaining men struggled for dominance, each trying to assert control over the dwindling population. Meanwhile, the women continued to navigate their precarious positions in a society ruled by violence and fear. By 1800, just 10 years after the mutineers had first arrived, almost all of the men had either been killed or died from disease. Only John Adams remained, along with a small group of women and children, including those born from the unions between the mutineers and the Tahitian women. It was under Adams' leadership that the island began to find some semblance of stability. He turned to religion, teaching the children Christian values and helping to maintain order on the island. In a strange twist of fate, the man who had once participated in one of history's most infamous mutinies became the moral compass for the next generation of Pitcairn Islanders. For nearly 2 decades, the outside world had no idea what had become of the bounty mutineers. It wasn't until 1808 that an American ship, the Topaz, stumbled upon Pitcairn Island and discovered the remnants of the bounty community. By that time, the island had become a peaceful, self-sustaining society under Adams' guidance. Pitcairn Island remains one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, with a population of fewer than 50 people today. The descendants of the mutineers and the Tahitian women still live there, carrying with them the legacy of their ancestors' dramatic and often tragic past. Subscribe to Truth, revealed to stay intrigued and informed.